The horizon stretched endlessly, a restless line between sky and sea. And for men with nowhere else to go, it wasn't just water. It was freedom, terror, and the faint promise of fortune. To the gun, grab some lines, prepare the bootleg. Words barked across a splintered deck at dawn. The smell of salt, sweat, and tar clung to everything like a second skin. There was no law out here, no courts, no kings. Beyond that horizon, where the last threads of authority unraveled, men created a world of their own. A brutal world, a fleeting one, but organized in ways that would shock anyone who thought pirates were just madmen drunk on rum and blood. Because that's the lie, isn't it? The one that Hollywood feeds us, the charming rogues chasing glory and gold. The truth was far uglier, far grittier. Nobody dreamed of this life as a boy. Nobody said, I want to grow up and live with a rope burn on my neck and a hangman waiting for me in some distant port. Pirates weren't born. They were made. By desperation, bad choices, rotten luck. They weren't heroes, but they weren't demons either. They were the scraps of a world that had chewed them up and spat them into the waves. Take a pirate ship from the golden age of piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730. Forget the neat rows of uniformed sailors you've seen in paintings. A pirate crew looked nothing like that. It looked like chaos stitched together by survival. One man missing an eye, another a leg, a former Navy gunner standing beside an escaped slave, an ex-doctor next to a runaway debtor, even the occasional tax collector who had traded ledgers for a cutlass. This wasn't a navy. This was a floating refuge for men who had nowhere else to belong. When authorities seized pirate ships, they wrote about the faces they found. Faces from every corner of the earth. Africans, Irish, English, Dutch, even Asians. Roughly a quarter of some crews were black, and not as slaves but as equals, often with a vote in every decision. Pirates didn't care about color. They cared if you could fight, pull your weight, and bleed when the time came. And if you could, then welcome aboard, brother. And that word, brother, wasn't just a pretty phrase. They meant it. Because when you've got nothing but the man standing next to you, when you know the noose is waiting if the law catches you, loyalty isn't a choice. It's the only thing keeping you alive. But don't mistake this loyalty for kindness. Pirate ships weren't floating utopias of equality and love. They were experiments in raw survival. And yet inside that chaos, something extraordinary happened. Something almost modern. You see, in the Royal Navies, a sailor was nothing. A dog to be beaten, starved, flogged for looking at an officer the wrong way. But on a pirate ship, things worked differently. Captains didn't rule like kings. They were more like elected leaders. And if a crew didn't like a captain's decisions, they could vote him out, sometimes in the middle of the ocean. Imagine that. A world ruled by monarchs, and out here on the edge of everything, these outlaws invented democracy. Crude, vicious, and imperfect, but democracy all the same. And it wasn't just voting on who led them. Pirates wrote contracts, actual written agreements signed by every man aboard. These weren't love letters to fairness. They were practical rules for survival. They spelled out everything: shares of loot, punishments for theft, even compensation for injuries. One article declared, lose a limb in battle, earn 800 pieces of 8. Lose an eye, that'll get you 100. To put that in perspective, a skilled laborer on land might earn 60 pieces in a whole year. Pirates offered better health coverage than most kingdoms, and with fewer forms to fill out. These rules weren't charity. They were insurance, built by men who knew pain was inevitable and fairness wasn't guaranteed unless they enforced it themselves. Every pirate signed those articles knowing the price of betrayal. Steal from the common chest, and you'd be left marooned on some barren spit of land with nothing but a pistol and one bullet. One for the seabirds or for yourself. The sea didn't forgive mistakes, and neither did pirates. Life aboard a pirate ship wasn't a dream of riches. It was a gamble against death, played out every single day. And the men who signed those articles, they weren't noble rebels fighting tyranny. They were survivors, and survival required rules sharper than any cutlass. When you read those articles now, you'd almost think they were drafted by lawyers. One clause might state how loot was divided, The captain got 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5, every other man 1 share. Fairer than any navy, where an officer might walk away with a fortune while the sailors who risked their necks went home with nothing but scars. Another clause said that gambling debts couldn't spiral out of control because broken men didn't make good fighters. But here's the twist. These laws weren't enforced by some distant admiral or king. They were enforced by the crew themselves. When a man broke the code, justice came fast. No courts, no lawyers, no appeals. A thief might find himself marooned on an island with only a bottle of water and that single-shot pistol. 1 round, 1 decision. Die slow or die quick. And yet, despite the harshness, these rules worked. They worked because they were born of necessity. The sea was a graveyard waiting for fools, and order, even pirate order, meant survival. Now picture the crew itself. The men who lived by these codes were a mix of everything polite society rejected. A former Navy officer stripped of rank for insubordination. A runaway slave who'd killed his master for a chance at freedom. A bankrupt merchant who saw more profit in crime than commerce. A disgraced surgeon who traded scalpels for swords. They came from different worlds, spoke different tongues, but aboard the same creaking deck, they were equals. Not out of virtue, but out of need. In the Caribbean of the 1600s, slavery ruled the plantations. Chains and whips carved the wealth of empires out of blood. Yet on some pirate ships, black men not only sailed free, they commanded respect, even leadership. It wasn't morality that made pirates colorblind. It was pragmatism. A good sailor was a good sailor, no matter his skin. And if he could swing a cutlass and hold a boarding line, he was worth more than any prejudice. There were women too, though rare and dangerous as a sudden storm. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, names whispered like curses in the ports. Women who fought harder than men because they had everything to prove and nothing to lose. One story tells of Mary Read, pistol in one hand, cutlass in the other, storming the deck while the men hid below during a battle. Her voice cut sharper than any blade. "Come up and fight if you're men, or stay down there and rot like dogs." Shamed, they climbed. Not because they were brave, but because pride stung worse than fear. But let's not romanticize too much. This wasn't equality in the modern sense. This was survival dressed as brotherhood. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the Coast, and their loyalty wasn't to flags or kings. It was to each other, to the men who would bleed beside them when the cannons roared. And those cannons, imagine the sound. Imagine the deck trembling under your feet, the air thick with smoke and splinters, the ocean itself shuddering as iron slammed into wood. That was the heartbeat of a pirate's life. Not the glitter of gold, but the thunder of guns and the stink of blood and powder. Still, most days there was no thunder, no gold, no glory, just the grind of living on a wooden coffin floating over an endless grave. Most of the time, a pirate ship was less like an adventure and more like a prison without walls. The mornings came fast, pulled out of sleep by the shout of the quartermaster or the boot of a shipmate. The sun wasn't up yet, but the crew was. Because daylight was survival, and laziness was a sin the ocean punished without mercy. The first meal? Don't imagine feasts and flagons of ale like the tavern tales tell. Breakfast was hardtack, those rock-hard biscuits that could break teeth unless you softened them in beer or rum. Sometimes salted meat if luck held. Mostly it didn't. Scurvy stalked the decks like a phantom, gnawing at gums, loosening teeth, hollowing men from the inside out. Smart captains raided plantations not for gold, but for limes and oranges, because a mouthful of blood was worse than an empty stomach. After the meager meal came the work. Endless, back-breaking, soul-grinding work. Forget what you be seen in the stories. Pirates didn't spend their days swinging from ropes with daggers in their teeth. They scrubbed decks on their knees, scouring the planks with holy stone and seawater until their knuckles bled. The sun roasted them alive while they scraped salt and rot from timber seams. That S where the phrase "between the devil and the deep blue sea" was born. The devil being the hardest seam to clean, running down the ship's spine. Sails had to be patched, ropes had to be tarred, cannons cleaned and oiled, pistols checked, powder dried in the sun because damp powder was death in a fight. They worked like ants in a world of endless blue, because a ship wasn't just a home, it was a heartbeat. When it faltered, and you drowned. Privacy? None. A man's world was the length of his hammock and the space of his sea chest if he had one. They slept in shifts, half the crew awake while the others collapsed in the heat-stale darkness below decks. Bathing was a joke. Rainstorms were the only showers, salt water the only soap. They stank. God, how they stank. Merchant sailors said they could smell a pirate ship before they saw it, and maybe that smell was fear as much as filth. And yet, for all this misery, men chose it. They chose it over the lash of a Navy officer, over the hunger of land, over the gallows that waited for debtors and thieves. Because out here, for all its filth and famine, a man could vote. A man could share the spoils. A man could be free, if only for a heartbeat before the rope tightened around his neck. That was the bargain. That was the dream beneath the dirt. Not riches, not fame, but freedom in its rawest, bloodiest form. Freedom. That word tasted sweeter than rum to the men who signed their names in jagged ink on the pirate articles. It wasn't the freedom kings promised in speeches or preachers thundered about on Sundays. It was the freedom of a man with nothing left to lose. The kind that burned hot and fast, like a cannon's flash, before the dark swallowed it whole. But what made them sign? What drove a man to trade the solid ground of land for a coffin of wood tossed on black water? Some were pressed into naval service and flogged raw for daring to speak. Some were slaves who broke their chains with blood and fire, fleeing to a sea that promised no masters. Others were merchants ruined by debt, soldiers left behind by armies, farmers with fields swallowed by famine. All found the same truth. Society had no place for them, so they made their own. Picture a moonless night in a stinking dockside tavern. A man sits hunched over a mug of sour beer, hands scarred, eyes hollow. Behind him, laughter roars like a storm. Pirates, their pockets fat from plunder, throwing dice and spilling gold across the table. One of them leans close and whispers, "Tired of starving, mate? Tired of bending knee to men who don't care if you live or die? Come sail with us. Out there, no lords, no kings, just men." And maybe for the first time in years, that hollow-eyed man feels something like hope. But what he doesn't see, what they never see, is the gallows waiting at the end of that hope. The ropes swaying in the wind like cruel smiles. Because no pirate grows old, not in truth. The sea eats them, or the law hangs them, and the world forgets their names. Except in stories, stripped of blood and stench, dressed up like heroes they never were. Yet, in the moment, that promise of freedom was enough. Enough to make them climb aboard a deck that reeked of tar and sweat. Enough to make them live by rules harsher than the laws they fled. Those rules, they were the spine of this savage democracy. And savage though it was, it worked. The captain might command in battle, but in all else, he was just another man. The crew voted on when to fight, when to flee, even when to throw their leader overboard. That power wasn't symbolic. Captains were deposed mid-voyage, stripped of command by men who'd had enough. And they accepted it, because they'd sworn to those articles like scripture written in salt and blood. Those articles didn't just promise fairness. They promised security in a world where nothing was secure. Lose an arm in a fight, you'd get 800 pieces of 8. Lose a finger, 100. Enough to buy a cottage on land, if you ever made it back. And that promise meant men didn't fear battle as much, because they knew they wouldn't starve if the cannonballs took their limbs. In a twisted way, these outlaws invented the first disability insurance plans long before kingdoms bothered to care. It wasn't charity, it was cold, brutal logic. A crew that felt cheated was a crew that mutinied, and mutiny, like rot, spread fast. So fairness wasn't kindness, it was survival. Still, the punishments were merciless. Steal from the common chest and you'd pray for a quick death. Marooning was the favorite sentence. Imagine it. A barren island, nothing but rock and thorn scrub. A bottle of water. A pistol with one bullet. Enough to live a day or two. Long enough to curse your own greed before thirst split your tongue and madness crawled in. That bullet wasn't for rescue. It was for mercy when you couldn't take the screaming in your head anymore. And so they lived, balanced on a blade's edge between brotherhood and betrayal, freedom and death. Nights brought no peace. The dark stretched forever, swallowing the ship whole, and the creak of timbers sounded like the ocean whispering its hunger. Men lay in their hammocks staring at the shadows, wondering if tomorrow would bring gold, or the grave. This was the truth no ballad ever sang. Not glory, but grit. Not riches, but rations of moldy biscuit and salted meat that stank like corpses in the heat. Not endless adventure, but endless toil, patching sails, scrubbing decks, hauling lines until your muscles screamed. And through it all, the sea, vast, merciless, beautiful, and utterly indifferent. Yet still they laughed. Still they gambled with dice carved from bone, sang songs in 10 languages, and drank until the world spun like a storm. Because when you live with death as your shadow, joy becomes defiance. Every laugh, every song was a spit in the face of fate. The hunt. That was the heartbeat of this life. Everything else, all the toil and hunger and stench, it existed for this single thing. The moment a black flag snapped in the wind and another ship loomed on the horizon like a fat, helpless prize. But hunting on the open sea wasn't like stalking deer in the woods. Out here, the world was too big, too empty. You could sail for weeks and see nothing but water and sky, both endless, both merciless. Men went mad in that waiting. They stared at the horizon until their eyes burned, praying for the sight of white sails like a starving man prays for bread. And when those sails finally rose, tiny as a ghost on the edge of the world, the deck came alive with fever. Every muscle, every nerve snapped taut. Men scrambled up the rigging, their hands slick with sweat and tar. The helmsman gripped the wheel like a lover's throat. The air itself seemed to thicken with bloodlust and fear, because no one knew how this would end. The captain stood calm, or at least he looked it. His eyes were knives, cutting through the haze as he measured the distance, the wind, the swell of the sea. One mistake, and the prize would slip away, or worse, turn out to be more than they could handle. Because not every merchantman was weak. Some carried hidden guns, soldiers hungry for pirate blood, captains who'd rather sink their ship than let it fall into outlaw hands. And yet, hunger burned hotter than fear. Hunger for gold, for rum, for the right to swagger into a port and drink until the world drowned in laughter. Hunger for a life that felt like something before the gallows claimed it. So the chase began. Sails strained against the wind. Timbers groaned like old bones, and the ship surged forward, cutting through waves like a blade through flesh. The prey ran, the hunter closed, and the distance shrank until men could see faces on the other deck. Wide-eyed, pale, mouthing prayers that vanished in the roar of the sea. Then came the storm of iron and smoke. Cannons thundered, belching fire that lit the sky like hell's own sunrise. Splinters flew like arrows tearing through flesh, ripping screams from throats. Men clung to ropes slick with blood, swung aboard with cutlasses flashing, pistols blazing, teeth bared in savage grins. This was no polite duel. This was slaughter dressed in chaos. And when the last shot faded, when the deck ran red and the air stank of powder and death, the spoils lay waiting. Chests heavy with coin, barrels of rum, silk soft as sin. Men roared in triumph, their laughter a howl against the void, because for a heartbeat they'd beaten fate. But the sea always took its due. A storm could rise without warning, snapping masts like twigs, hurling men screaming into black water. Or the navy could appear, gray sails blooming on the horizon, bringing the law in iron and fire. And the law never forgave. When they caught you, they made a show of it. Chains, trials that were theater more than justice. And at the end, the rope, always the rope, your feet kicking air while the crowd jeered, your last breath tasting of tar and salt. Every pirate knew that ending. They didn't care. Because out there under the wild sky with the wind in their hair and the world at their feet, they'd lived more in a year than most men lived in a lifetime. And that was worth the noose. So they sailed on, laughing into the teeth of death, because they were pirates. And to be a pirate was to burn bright and brief, a spark in the dark before the ocean swallowed you whole.